All right, Josh Bauer just referenced to the slightly anomalous period in the history of American political economy, which was after World War II. Bob Herbert.
Well, obviously in the 50s it was a tough time for blacks. Women did not have a great deal in the way of opportunities either. But in those early post-war decades, the 50s, 60s, and into the 70s, there was tremendous movement up in many of the groups, and it included African Americans and it included women. But I think the most important thing is that there was movement in the right direction. Progress was being made, whereas now, where a lot of people are better off, certainly than they were back in the 50s, but we're going backwards. And I think that's the big thing that we need to keep our eyes on.
And if you look at median wages, they're about where they were. Inflation
in the 70s.
Yeah, well, it depends on sort of what measure you use, household or individual.
Yeah.
For household, it's around 1996. For individuals, it's back to the 70s. That's partly due to the fact that there's been a substitution effect as we have more two-income earner households. Right. But this question of mobility, I think, Josh, because to me, these two conversations about food stamps and mobility are very linked, right? Which is that if you're going to say, you know, there's this kind of saying, you know, we don't believe in equality of outcomes, we believe in equality of opportunity, and, you know, everyone talks about an opportunity society, you know, well, then poor kids have to get enough food so they're not, like, starving, you know, in order to achieve their whatever human potential. Like, it seems to me like even the most kind of conservative vision of providing equality of opportunity has to include some money for food stamps.
Well, and I think higher ed is another big component to this, and I think that we have so much focus on how broken our healthcare sector is and how much inflation there is in that, and that's because that's on the budget. In higher ed, we've had basically the same inflation trend as in healthcare, but because much of that cost is basically just shifted to the students.
Consumers, yes, exactly.
It's not taken as a big a public policy concern, but a big thing that's cementing this inequality is that education is increasingly expensive, so it's a lot harder for people to work their way through college than it used to be. And
they start, when they do, they start with tremendous amounts of debt.
And so we talk about, you know, how much money to throw at higher education, but really the fundamental problem here is just that the cost, no matter who the payer is, has grown so much in a way that is not producing new value, and that really needs to be addressed so that it can be made affordable to the masses.
I mean, I think that if you're also going to address education, starting on the early side,
sure.
The average poor child enters into elementary school knowing something like 2,000 words less.
Right.
Having a vocabulary that's so that begins as an obstacle right at the beginning of the school.
But what is the disconnect between the Republican electorate and Republican elected officials? Because we do see support for programs such as SNAP with the general electorate and in particular with Republicans. So what is going on in between is my question.
I think there's two ways to think about it. One is that it's sort of trying to demonize the poor and trying to, you know, basically use it as a political cudgel, which is one part of it, I think. But I also think it ends up being a process of elimination. What's happened basically is the Republicans say we want to cut spending so that we can reduce deficits, but we won't touch all the stuff that our senior citizen constituency uses, right? Which is a huge part of the budget, and we're not going to touch defense. So then we're left with a quarter of the budget. So then yes, if you define yourself a quarter of the budget to make up all of them, you got to take a hatchet to everything, right? And so you end up in the places where you can attack without having to feel the wrath of political constituencies that actually support you and vote for you. So it's inevitable that you end up sort of backing yourself into SNAP. All right, what do we know now that we didn't know last week? My answer's after this.